Welcome to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. Today we will be looking at the brain. So we start with the spinal cord. The function of our spinal cord is to connect the brain to the rest of the nervous system. We already studied this as part of the central nervous system. And if there's a dysfunction in our spinal cord, we will have no reflex actions and no communication between the brain and the body. You may not feel any pain. You may also lose all sensation. So the hindbrain is the oldest part of the brain. Almost all animals have a hindbrain. It controls basic biological structures. If we were ever in a coma, the hindbrain is what sort of keeps our body going. So our brain is built like an ancient city. So the hindbrain is the oldest. We call it the lizard brain or the ancient brain. The midbrain is built on top of that, and the forebrain is built on top of the midbrain. So if we have damage to any other part of our brain, we can still function, basic functions, as long as the hindbrain is still there and still intact. The medulla oblongata is at the top of the spinal cord. We always want to be very careful you never get hit there at the top of the spinal cord. It controls vital organs. It is involved in controlling your blood pressure, your heart rate, and your breathing. Now, a person will die if there's damage to the medulla oblongata because it controls all basic life functions. And this is what happened to the NASCAR race car driver Dale Earnhardt. They actually think it was his medulla oblongata that was hit. The pons, think of it as a lot of Z's, like you're going to sleep, pons, right? Because it regulates sleep and waking and dreaming and some movement and walking and vital functions, but really we think of it as sort of dreamy, sleepy time. And in dysfunction, we have disruption with our sleep and we don't get some messages to the higher brain. Reticular formation is for alertness. It's the relay center of the forebrain. It sends the messages, the information. It's like the gatekeeper. It controls up to 25 behaviors. So if we have dysfunction there, then the forebrain won't be alerted that there's trouble and it cannot prioritize. It cannot decide what we need to do first. And this can happen if we're unconscious or in a coma. So again, it controls 25 behaviors like sleeping, walking, eating, urinating, defecating, and so on. So it's kind of important that the brain tells us which one of those we need to do first and in what order. So it ranks those messages in terms of importance. We also call this the reticular activating system, or RAS, R-A-S, reticular activating system, because it activates to tell us which one of these to do. It is the gatekeeper to all of our messages. The midbrain, again, like an ancient city, we build one layer on top of the other. So it connects the hindbrain with the forebrain. The forebrain is where we really have all of our higher thought processes, critical thinking. It's what we think makes us human. It's the largest, highest part of the brain, and it's the part we try to protect when we're wearing helmets for football, bicycling, horseback riding, all kinds of activities, skateboarding. We want to protect the forebrain. The cerebrum has two hemispheres in the upper brain, and it allows for higher level thinking. It's connected by the corpus callosum. We'll spend some time looking at that. It is the largest part of the brain. In dysfunction, we can't have higher level thinking. You won't be able to get to critical thinking, problem solving, higher levels. So it's divided into two parts, right and left, and we'll look at these in more detail. We tend to say that each hemisphere has its own specialization. Now, there's been some proof and arguments about this lately, but if we just stick to the basics, the left hemisphere will control your right hand because it crosses over to your right hand. We tend to think of it as logic, math, sequences. Language and speech is controlled there. So if you have problems in language and speech, it's in your left hemisphere. If you have problems with logic and sequence tasks, it's in your left hemisphere. So writing and math and sciences. So we tend to say that somebody who is left-brained tends to be more of a STEM, math, science type of person. Now, the right hemisphere controls left hand, and we tend to think that people who use their left hand dominant tend to be more creative people. It's also spatial, creative tasks, creative thinking, fantasy, art, music appreciation, and muscle coordination are in the right hemisphere. The corpus callosum is the bundle of fibers that connect these two, connect right to left. So it helps to coordinate the function of the two hemispheres. And if there's any kind of disruption there, then you lose communication between the two hemispheres. So when it's cut, then the two cerebral hemispheres cannot communicate. And we call that split brain. And we're going to be talking about split brain studies. So that affects your perception because information is only coming into half of the brain and it doesn't travel to the other half of the brain. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer. It's where all of our decision making happens. It's for higher order thought processes, sensory, motor, cognitive functions. And if there's a problem, then the lobes can't carry out their specific functions. So the wrinkles are called fissures, and the folds, the highest point, are called the gyrus, and the low points are called the sulcus. So within our brain, we have sort of mountains and valleys. And if we were to lay our brain out completely flat, it would stretch out to being 6 feet square if we could take it out of our head and lay it flat on the table. So it's all the mountains and valleys that make it look like this bundle of cauliflower here. The basal ganglia controls part of the motor system for smooth, coordinated movements for like athletes and dancers. So for dysfunction, you would lose control over your muscular movements. You could have tics. We'll look at some disorders with tics. Part of Parkinson's disease, it could attack the basal ganglia's production of dopamine. The motor cortex is a map of the motor receptors in the brain. It is in the frontal lobe and it organizes the body parts on the brain cortex. So all of our efferent neurons, the neurons that come from our muscles, from the motor muscles, they're going to be here and we can map them all out. And if we have a dysfunction there, then you can't feel what's going on. You couldn't move your toe if you were squeezed, or if the doctor asks you, to they hit your knee and they ask you to kick that leg out and you can't do that. They know there's a problem with your motor cortex. The sensory cortex is slightly further back. It's in the parietal lobe. This is a map of your sensory receptors. This is where all the afferent neurons travel to. This is where we receive information on pain, touch, smell, temperature, all of that. So for dysfunction here, you wouldn't feel it if somebody like poked your toe with a toothpick or something sharp. You really wouldn't be able to sense that. And this is a map from your book of all the motor and sensory cortex and what it looks like. And we've been able to, over the years, use direct stimulation in the brain. We will look at how to do that in class and directly stimulate all of these areas. And that's how we know that if we stimulate this area, it affects the hand or the leg or the eye. That's how we know it. So the brain has 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And this is how we remember the lobes of the brain. We say Freud took his puppy outside. Freud took his puppy outside would be frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. So the frontal lobe is all of our decision making, our planning, our judgment. It's where our personality is held. It's where self-awareness of who we are and what it means to be human and why we're alive and where all of our big philosophical questions come from. So it's where we get the initiative to do things like plan to go to college or plan to have a career, the ability to make a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or a weekend plan, to make long-term plans comes from that section of our frontal lobe. Dysfunction is a lack of planning, a lack of insight, maybe abstract thought. We'll talk about lobotomies and how they can damage this area. Sometimes lobotomies were used to lessen psychotic episodes, and so removing the frontal lobe seems like a good idea at the time. When we see people who can't function socially and they live as hermits, we typically see some kind of dysfunction in the frontal lobe. Okay, so we remember the frontal lobe because it's at the front of the head. So I put a little Einstein in there. So Einstein, all of your intelligence lives in the front door, the frontal lobe. Right, the parietal lobe kind of goes across the top, right behind the frontal lobe. It's still across the top of the head. It's in blue. These are all of our sensations. Again, this is where we process touch and sensation. It's where that sensory cortex lives. So if there's dysfunction there, we can't interpret touch. You could have a problem sensing things like, we talked about the toothpick on your toe, or you can't sew. You can't use those little fine motor movements and things with your fingers and your touch. So how we remember the parietal lobe, think of a piranha biting the top of your head and it hurts. So that one might be a way to think of parietal and piranha, and it's on the top of your head, and that's where the parietal lobe sits. The occipital lobe actually takes all the information from our eyes, and we're going to look at how I know the eyes are on the front of our head, but that information travels all the way to the back of our head. So it's receiving and processing anything visual through the visual cortex. It's how we interpret visual information from the optic nerve. The way we remember this, do you ever hear that your mom has her eyes in the back of the head, right? Or your teacher has eyes in the back of her head. So you never could get into, you never could do anything without the teacher or your mom knowing what you were doing. And we're like, do you have eyes in the back of your head? So think about the occipital lobe at the back of your head and controlling your eyesight. So dysfunction, you can't interpret vision, blindness, things like that can happen. If you get a really bad blow to the back of your head, you hit the back of your head really, really hard, you can lose your vision for a little while or have blurry vision. And another way to remember it is to think of the octopus, occipital octopus, and maybe all of his tentacles are really eyeballs, and that helps you think of it. Either one, whichever one helps you remember. The temporal lobe, think of the word tempo. Tempo is like a drum beat, like a sound, like a noise. So temporal lobe is auditory. It's how we interpret sound. So it's hearing. It's also face recognition and long-term memory. But it's the sound. So it's right behind your temples. So if you think about where you're listening to music, if you've got like your old-fashioned kind of headsets there, it's right there on your ears, and the temporal lobe is right behind it. So dysfunction, there's no interpretation of hearing and no facial recognition. So this is what the brain looks like when we are hearing, seeing, and speaking. And you can see 3 out of our 4 lobes are being represented here. So again, the temporal lobe, think of tempo. Think of tempo, drum beat right there, right by the ear, right where we hear. The limbic system is fascinating. So much happens in the limbic system. It's the emotional center of the brain. It's where we have aggression and fear and pleasure and pain all in the limbic system. So how do we remember it? We remember it with HATCH, HATCH, hippocampus, amygdala, thalamus, cerebellum, hypothalamus. That's how we remember the limbic system. Let's go through each one of these. So the hippocampus is memory. It is processing and storing memories. Very important that we remember the hippocampus. So how do we remember it? You might see a hippo on your college campus or at camp. Well, you would definitely remember seeing a hippo on campus. So that's how we remember the hippocampus. And if there's dysfunction there, we can't transfer short-term memories into long-term memories. There's a problem with amnesia in the hippocampus. So the amygdala, how do we remember the amygdala? Oh, Amy, you're so emotional, right? That's how we remember the amygdala. So it controls the basest of our fears. It controls aggression. It controls actually which hand we use, right or left-handed, but that's not as important as knowing that it's our stronger emotions, aggression and fear. Now, if you have a dysfunction there, then you don't really detect emotions or fear the same way as other people, or you can't control your anger or your fear. So we see this with phobias. We see this with anger management issues. We see this with people who exhibit criminal behavior, antisocial personality disorder, and so forth. They seem to have a smaller or disconnected amygdala. It's not making that connection there. The thalamus receives sensory information. So it's like an old-fashioned switchboard, taking in the phone calls and then telling you where to send the information. It relays the sensory information to all the areas of the brain. So dysfunction, you can't get the information. It doesn't get up to the higher centers of the brain. So something is happening and you're in trouble, you're in danger, and the brain doesn't register. It doesn't get higher. It just kind of stays stuck at the sensory level. So the thalamus also processes smell. So smell is directly hardwired into the parietal lobe and it's connected to the thalamus. And smell is very connected to our ability to reproduce, to our reproduction drive, and to pheromones. And another thing about the thalamus we'll talk about in a different chapter is synesthesia is a dysfunction where people have letters that are colors and colors that make you itch and foods and flavors have pointy edges and it's sort of a miswiring, a crossing over of the sensory neurons and that can also happen in the thalamus. So cerebellum is on the bottom rear of the brain. It means little brain, and it's one of the oldest parts of the brain. And it also comes in two parts, right and left, just like the upper part of the brain comes in two parts, right and left. This controls all movement, all balance, all motor control and coordination. This also changes a great deal when you're in your teenage years. If you ever have a day where you feel a little awkward, and you trip a lot, it's because your cerebellum is trying to work stuff out. It usually stops by the time you get to your early 20s. So, dysfunction there, you could have problems with movement, very jerky motions, loss of balance, loss of coordination. How do we remember that? Think of cerebellum as two southern bells, right? Sarah and Bella, and they're southern bells. And see, they have their little parasol, their little umbrella that helps them balance. And so they're all about poise and they're all about balance and movement. And that'll help you remember the cerebellum. Hypothalamus is reward and pleasure. We'll look at some studies in class. So it is where we see a lot of dopamine receptors, a lot of reward and pleasure part of our brain. It regulates hunger also. It regulates all of our motivation and emotional functions can happen there as well. And it controls the pituitary gland of the endocrine system. So if there's a dysfunction, you can't control your hunger. Maybe you can't control your body temperature. You're hot, you're cold, you're hot, you're cold. We see both anorexia or obesity. So eating disorders are tied into the hypothalamus. All right. Association areas are any area that has a sensory association to it. So we've looked at several of them already. So our four lobes, parietal, temporal, occipital, and frontal lobe, all are association areas. And we're going to look at Broca and Wernicke's area, which are also association areas. So if this area of the brain is associated with, say, language, that's an association area. If this area of the brain is associated with processing speech or associated with a processing vision, then that's what we mean by an association area. And again, here are the four that we've already covered. So Broca's area. The function of Broca's area, it controls muscles that produce speech. So Broca's aphasia is a disorder we're going to talk about. You are unable to make the right movements to talk. You understand what's being said to you. You understand what's being read, but you cannot make fluent sentences. And this can happen if you have a stroke. This can happen if you have an injury or an accident. So an example is you're trying to say leg, but instead you say egg. You know what you're trying to say, but you can't quite get it out. A different type of aphasia is Wernicke. So I know there's a W there, but it's pronounced like a V, Wernicke, Wernicke's area. So it interprets written and spoken speech and meaningful sentences, the fact that we can make meaningful sentences. And if there's a dysfunction there in Wernicke's aphasia, we call that, then you jumble your syntax and your grammar. You are speaking fluently, you are flowing, but your words don't make any sense. We call that word salad. It's total nonsense. It's complete gibberish. It's gobbledygook, and nobody understands what you're trying to say. And again, we see this with injuries, stroke victims. There's a couple different things that could cause damage to Wernicke's area. So these are the areas that we use for language or linguistic processing, and we'll touch on these again when we get to the language section. But Wernicke's area, Broca's area, we use the temporal lobe, we need the frontal cortex, and we use white matter. Those are all the areas that we use. And now you know all the parts of your brain, and you're ready for class, and you're ready for your brain project.